So, think about this for a second. You break your arm, right? You go to the hospital, and they take an X-ray.
Right.
And the doctor slaps the image up on the light board, points to this jagged white line, and says, there's the problem. It's totally clean. It's binary. We inherently crave that kind of diagnostic certainty, I think.
Oh, absolutely. We want to be able to just look at a system, spot the broken piece, and know exactly how to fix it.
Exactly.
Hmm.
But when you step out of the hospital and, into the wild, when an entire river system's apex predators seemingly just vanish overnight, that X-ray machine is completely useless. You're no longer looking at a clean fracture. You're looking into literal and diagnostic muddy waters. And today, we're going to solve a 40-year ecological cold case. Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah, we have a really fascinating one today.
We do. We're going to explore the massive, sprawling transformation of the lower Ouachita Saline River system down in southeast Arkansas, basically looking at the period from roughly 1985 to the present day.
And, it is an incredibly complex geographic corridor. It really defies any sort of simple explanation because if you travel down the system, you experience this radical physical gradient.
Right, it changes so fast.
It really does. You start up in the Saline River, which is actually the very last free-flowing, completely undammed river in the entire Ouachita River Basin. It's wild, it's unpredictable, driven entirely by the natural pulse of rain and the seasons.
But then you keep going.
Right, but as you move downstream, that wild current slows down and ultimately just dumps into the Felsenthal Lock and Dam pool. And this is a heavily manipulated, artificially stabilized aquatic arena. You are moving from untamed nature directly into the heart of modern human engineering.
And sitting right at the bottom of that gradient, like right in that engineered pool,
Yeah.
is a foundational mystery. Because if you go to the boat ramps and talk to the local anglers, the people who have literally spent their entire lives on this water,
Yeah.
they will swear to you that the river is dead.
Yeah, they're very vocal about it.
Oh, extremely. They talk about this golden era of fishing back in the late 90s and early 2000s, and they insist that after that, the sport fish just vanished, like the population totally crashed. But, and this is kind of the crux of our mission today, we are looking at a massive stack of scientific evidence.
Right, the data tells a completely different story.
A completely different story. I mean, we have acoustic telemetry tracking data, we have highly specific botanical surveys, low-frequency electrofishing logs, and the empirical data proves, without a shadow of a doubt, that the fish are absolutely still there. The biological biomass of this river system is incredibly robust.
The river didn't die.
No, the river didn't die at all. It was completely re-engineered from the inside out. And what's fascinating here is that what we are examining today isn't just, a localized fishing report or a complaint from a few frustrated boaters.
Right.
We are looking at a profound, overarching narrative that weaves together biomechanics, hydrology, and centuries of human history. This is really a story about how human ambition has constantly clashed with this aquatic ecosystem. It's everyone.
Everyone. We're talking about everyone from ancient indigenous mound builders to ruthless industrial lumber barons, all the way to modern municipal engineers. Every single group looked at this water and tried to mold it to fit their own specific blueprints.
Okay, let's unpack this because I want to give you, the listener, a framework for how to think about this right out of the gate. Think of this deep dive like an ecological murder mystery where the victim isn't actually dead.
I like that.
Yeah, like they didn't get killed, they just moved, changed all their locks, and completely stopped answering the door. The fish didn't disappear, they just achieved perfect concealment.
That is a highly effective way to visualize the current state of the river. But to truly understand the mechanics of how the modern river was engineered and how those fish managed to build such a perfect fortress to hide in, we kind of have to look back. We cannot start in 1985.
We had to go way back.
Way back. We have to look at the foundation this entire system was built upon. We must begin with the very first human beings who learned to manipulate the raw materials of this basin. Its mud, its salt, and its unpredictable currents.
So we are rewinding the clock way, way back. Long before the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers ever showed up with blueprints for concrete dams, there were people utilizing this river basin with a level of sophistication that honestly puts modern logistics to shame.
Absolutely.
We're talking about the late archaic poverty point culture, roughly, 1730 to 1100 BCE. These were technically hunter-gatherers, but they weren't just like scraping by in the woods. They were building monumental earthworks and running extensive downstream trade networks. The sources specifically highlight their trade of heat-treated Arkansas novaculite.
Yeah, and the novaculite trade is a brilliant example of prehistoric industrial science. Novaculite is this highly dense microcrystalline quartz found in the Ouachita
It's
Mountains.
basically like glass, right?
Exactly. It's incredibly sharp, which makes it a superior tool stone for blades and projectile points. But these early peoples didn't just pick up rocks and trade them. They had to understand the geological strata well enough to mine the highest quality seams.
Right.
And more importantly, they engineered a chemical change in the stone itself through pyrotechnology. They learned that if you carefully heat treat the novaculite, you alter its crystalline structure.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, making it much easier to nap and shape into precise, deadly tools. They essentially manufactured a premium technological product and exported it all the way down the river valleys to the Gulf Coast.
That implies a massive understanding of thermodynamics, just trial and error over generations. But as we move forward in time, the relationship between these early populations and the landscape evolves from just physical survival and trade into something, well, deeply spiritual.
It gets really complex.
It does. The geology actually becomes the foundation for their cosmology. I want to talk about the Baytown and early Caddoan peoples, specifically a location in Ashley County known as the Big Mound Ridge Site, or 3AS6 in archaeological terms. We're looking at a period between 400 AV and 700 AD.
Right.
The landform itself is a natural geological ridge, but it's not just a random hill. It forms an elongated shape that looks strikingly like a bird's head, a beak, and wings.
Right. Archaeologists refer to this as a found effigy. So it wasn't entirely built by human hands. It was a natural formation that the indigenous populations recognized and sort of adopted.
They saw the shape and ran with it.
Exactly. For them, this bird-shaped ridge was likely interpreted as the physical embodiment of a guardian spirit of the upper world, which is commonly represented as the great eagle in southeastern indigenous belief systems. But the truly astonishing element here isn't just the shape, it's the mathematical alignment.
This is the part that blew my mind.
It's incredible. Geospatial modeling of this terrestrial ridge reveals that its primary central axis is oriented at an exact azimuth of approximately 224 degrees.
Okay, let's pause on that because azimuth 224 sounds like a flight coordinate from a sci-fi movie. For someone just standing on this dirt mound looking up at the sky back in 550 AD, what does that actually mean? Like, what are they seeing?
Well, an azimuth is simply a measurement of direction along the horizon, with north being 0 degrees, east being 90, south 180, and so on. So 224 degrees points toward the southwest.
Okay, got it.
And if you run complex astronomical retro calculations to wind the night sky back to the year 550 AD, you find that this specific 224-degree alignment pointed flawlessly toward the visual rising of the core of the Milky Way during the autumn evenings.
And in southeastern indigenous cosmology, the Milky Way isn't just a pretty collection of stars. It is the river of souls. It is the literal celestial road that the dead must traverse to reach the afterlife. So these people found a massive bird-shaped ridge on the earth, realized it was pointing perfectly to the road of the dead in the sky, and used it as a permanent terrestrial guide, a psychopomp. They literally synchronized their mortuary rituals with the geology of the earth and the astronomy of the sky. That is just a breathtaking level of observational science.
It really is a profound synthesis of environment and belief. But, we have to remember that this deep connection to the environment also meant they were entirely at its mercy.
Right, because nature isn't always kind.
Exactly. Their society eventually transitioned to rely heavily on early horticulture. They were cultivating native plants like chenopodium, maygrass, and squash. And the harsh reality of human history is that whenever a society tethers itself to agricultural plots, it becomes acutely vulnerable to abrupt climatic shocks. The weather totally dictates your survival.
Which sets the stage for a massive catastrophic shock. The sources detail the late Antique Little Ice Age, or the LALIA event, which hit in 536 AD. We're talking about massive global volcanic eruptions. But how does a volcano erupting somewhere else on the planet fundamentally alter the lives of people living in an Arkansas River Valley?
It really comes down to atmospheric mechanics. When you have a massive volcanic eruption, it injects millions of tons of sulfur dioxide and ash into the stratosphere.
Just blocking out the sky.
Yeah, these particles form sulfate aerosols that literally reflect incoming solar radiation back into space. The sun is blocked, global temperatures plummet. This climate shock violently disrupted the seasonal atmospheric circulation patterns across the entire northern hemisphere.
Wow.
For the early Caddoan people in the Ouachita Saline Basin, this meant their reliable seasonal rainfall just vanished, leading to multi-year crop failures.
So they're suddenly looking at a landscape where the crops won't grow, the wild game is likely migrating or dying off, and winter is brutally long. The psychological panic must have been immense.
Oh, it created an ecological brittle state. When resources become that scarce, you face famine, and famine breeds intense conflict over whatever food is left. To survive this environmental instability, the society had to adapt profoundly.
They couldn't just keep doing what they were doing.
No, they couldn't survive in small, scattered, horticultural bands anymore. They were forced to centralize their political and social structures. They started aggregating their populations into larger, fortified, highly organized communities to protect storehouses and manage scarce resources.
So it forced them together.
Yes, this climatic trauma acted as a catalyst, eventually leading to the highly complex, hierarchical, Mississippian-influenced societies that European explorers like Hernando de Soto encountered when they finally arrived in 1541.
Right, and by the time de Soto and his expedition tear through the region, the geopolitical landscape is dominated by the Quapaw people. And I love this detail from the historical records. The French later called the Quapaw the fine men.
Yeah, a term of immense respect.
They were described as incredibly tall, brave, and operating with a fascinating, pragmatic social structure. For instance, the sources note that a marriage could be formalized as simply as a man offering an unclean leg of venison and the woman offering an ear of husked corn. It was a literal transaction of survival calories.
Very practical.
Extremely practical. But what really dominates the historical accounts from these European chroniclers is their absolute shock at the aquatic biomass they were pulling out of the river. The Spanish wrote about the Quapaw harvesting massive beggars.
Right, so the term beggars was used by the Spanish to describe the massive species of catfish native to the system. You know, almost certainly the flathead or blue catfish.
The monsters.
The absolute monsters. The chroniclers documented these fish weighing up to 150 pounds, noting with astonishment that the heads alone made up a third of their total body weight.
That's horrifying and amazing.
It really is. They also described what they called the peel fish, which modern biologists easily identify as the paddlefish due to that distinctive, long, spatula-like rostrum or snout. The sheer scale and volume of the fishery was staggering. The Quapaw weren't just catching individual fish. They utilized vast engineered nets to capture massive surplus yields.
Imagine being a starving Spanish explorer and watching someone pull a 150-pound river monster out of the mud. But of course, the Quapaw's dominance eventually waned, and the European influence seeped deeply into the basin. You have the French Creoles arriving first. And they were chasing something far more basic than gold. They were chasing a fundamental chemical necessity.
Salt.
Exactly, salt. They discovered these natural saline springs bubbling up along the riverbanks, which they named l'eau de sal. That eventually gets anglicized to the Saline River. Salt, at that time, wasn't just a seasoning. It was literally the only way to preserve meat and cure hides to survive the winter.
It was life or death.
It really was. And then following the Louisiana Purchase, you have the American pioneers flooding down the Southwest Trail, establishing harsh frontier settlements like Saline Crossing. This era is where the sheer grit and mandatory scientific ingenuity of pioneer life really takes center stage. I read through these accounts, and I genuinely think of these pioneer women as frontier chemical engineers.
That is entirely accurate. The domestic economy of the isolated pioneer household could not rely on supply chains. It required a total, exhaustive reliance on the surrounding ecology. Every single aspect of food preservation, hygiene, and domestic utility demanded empirical, hands-on application of chemistry and thermodynamics.
They couldn't just run to the store.
No, not at all. Perhaps the best example of this is the grueling process of saponification.
Right, making soap. We have this romanticized vision of the 1800s as this simpler time where people churned butter and lived off the land.
Yeah.
But making lye soap out of pig fat and tree ash isn't simple. It is incredibly precise, high-stakes chemistry. Walk us through exactly how they pulled this off, because the mechanics are wild.
Yeah, well, the process began months in advance. Throughout the winter, these families would meticulously save all the hardwood ashes from their hearths. They placed these ashes into an ash hopper, which was essentially a large V-shaped wooden trough.
Okay, so a giant wooden funnel full of ash.
Basically, yes. When they needed lye, they would pour water over the top of the ashes. The water slowly percolated downward through the ash matrix, acting as a solvent to extract potassium hydroxide. The resulting highly alkaline liquid that dripped out of the bottom was lye,
And that stuff is dangerous.
highly caustic. At the same time, whenever they slaughtered a hog, they would render the pork fat for cooking lard, and they saved the residual rendered tissue, which they called cracklins.
So you have this bucket of highly basic caustic lye water and a pile of fatty pig cracklins. How do you turn that into something you use to wash your face?
They would combine these two raw ingredients into a massive 50-gallon iron kettle and build a large fire beneath it outdoors. When you apply heat, the potassium hydroxide in the lye reacts violently with the triglycerides contained in the animal fat.
And there's the saponification.
Exactly. This is the chemical reaction known as saponification. The process breaks the fat molecules apart, synthesizing two new substances, glycerin and soap. But it wasn't a passive process. The pioneer women had to constantly monitor the thermodynamics of the boil.
Like watching a volatile science experiment.
Very much so. They had to control the fire precisely to ensure the mixture didn't boil over, while checking the chemical ratios until the substance reached the correct consistency. It was either a gelatinous soft soap for laundry or a hard mass that could be cooled and cut into solid bars. It required a rigorous, intuitive understanding of pH balances and thermal control, all executed over an open, unpredictable wood fire.
One wrong move, and you either have a pot of useless greasy water or you've literally burned your skin off with lye. We think of the 1800s as a simpler time, but isn't making lye soap out of pig fat and tree ash incredibly precise, high-stakes chemistry?
It absolutely is.
And it wasn't just hygiene, it was cellular biology applied to food preservation. We see this with their method for lactofermentation. They would harvest cabbage, quarter it, pack it into massive wooden barrels, and layer it heavily with salt, weighing the whole thing down with rocks.
The sauerkraut method.
Yeah. The salt draws the cellular water out of the cabbage leaves via osmosis. This creates an anaerobic or oxygen-free brine environment. In that specific environment, natural lactic acid bacteria thrive, fermenting the cabbage into sauerkraut. This lowers the pH, preventing rotting, and crucially safely preserves the vitamin C content throughout the barren winter so the family didn't die of scurvy.
They were manipulating microbiology without even having a word for it. And, when survival was threatened, this chemical ingenuity was pushed to absolute extremes. During the Civil War, the Confederate Army in this region was completely blockaded and starved for basic logistical supplies. The quartermaster in Little Rock actually issued a desperate formal directive for local citizens to harvest Ouachita catfish and alligator gar.
To eat them.
No, not primarily for food. They needed the fish for their natural oils. They were extracting the lipid-rich oils from the flesh of the catfish and the gar to use in the chemical tanning process for leather.
Wait, really?
Yes, they needed that fish oil to cure animal hides to make boots and harnesses for the troops.
That is the definition of desperate logistics. But surviving this landscape wasn't just about mastering chemistry over boiling pot. The actual physical environment of the West Gulf coastal plain demanded that every inhabitant be a master of their immediate biomechanics.
Yeah, the mud.
The mud. If we're talking about the physical reality of the Ouachita Saline Basin, we absolutely have to talk about the mud. This is one of my favorite details from the source material. If you try to walk along the banks of the Saline River tributaries like Flat Creek, you encounter a very specific type of soil called archibutless silt loam. And when this stuff gets saturated by the winter rains, it acts as a non-Newtonian fluid.
Right. Specifically, saturated archibutless silt loam acts as a shear-thinning, non-Newtonian fluid. And the physics of moving through this are uniquely punishing for humans.
That's awful.
It is. When you step onto the mud, your foot applies an initial vertical ground reaction force. Because it is a shear-thinning fluid, that force instantly exceeds the soil's yield stress. The solid ground literally liquefies beneath your foot, and you sink deep into the matrix. But sinking isn't the primary issue.
It never is.
No, the real biomechanical crisis occurs during extraction.
Right, getting your foot back out.
Yeah.
Because when you try to lift your leg during the upward swing phase of your walking gait, your boot pulls away from the mud at the bottom of the hole, but the wet mud collapses inward over the top of your foot. It creates a localized vacuum beneath your sole. You are essentially generating negative lift.
Precisely. To pull your foot out of that mud, your human hip flexor muscles have to generate immense muscular torque. You aren't just lifting the weight of your leg, you are literally forced to tear the physical matrix of the mud apart to allow air or water to rush down into the hole and equalize the atmospheric pressure.
It's exhausting.
It is physically exhausting. And bipedal humans, with our high center of gravity, struggle immensely against these fluid-solid mechanics.
We just weren't built for it. But the local wildlife has evolved highly specialized biomechanical adaptations to conquer this exact problem. The sources provide this fascinating, almost comical biomechanical case study. They observed a human researcher struggling to walk through this exact mud while carrying an uncooperative domestic rooster.
A great mental image.
Oh, the best. The human is constantly sinking, deploying rapid, panicked postural adjustments, waving their free arm around just to keep their center of gravity from toppling over.
The bipedal mechanics are failing. But if you observe the rooster in that same environment, if you release that bird on a steep, slick, nearly liquid clay bank, it doesn't sink and struggle. It negotiates the terrain flawlessly by deploying a technique known as wing-assisted incline running, or WARE.
And to be clear, this isn't flying. The bird isn't lifting off the ground.
No, it is a completely different aerodynamic mechanism. The bird runs up the slick incline on its feet, but it simultaneously beats its wings at a specific angle. The wings generate aerodynamic vortex rings that do not produce upward lift. Instead, they press the bird downward.
Pushing it into the mud.
Exactly. The wings act as a thrust vector that pushes the bird's feet violently into the mud, artificially increasing the gravitational normal force. By artificially multiplying its weight against the ground, the bird instantly increases its traction on the highly lubricated clay, allowing it to sprint up a surface where a human would simply slide to the bottom.
It's using its wings like the spoiler on the back of a Formula One race car, pushing itself down into the track to get grip. It's brilliant. But, this entire era of intense individual survival, of fighting the vacuum mud, of making lye soap out of ash, of relying entirely on the whims of the local ecology, it couldn't last forever.
No, it was bound to change.
That kind of localized abundance inevitably attracted a new force. A force that didn't just want to survive the river basin, but wanted to conquer it, grit it out, and commodify it on a global scale. Enter industrial capitalism.
Right. This transition brings us to the late 19th century, which saw the aggressive expansion of the timber empire into the virgin pine and hardwood forests of southeast Arkansas. And the human embodiment of this industrial takeover was a man named Edgar Woodward Cap Gates.
Here is where the human drama really gets interesting. It's 1898, and Cap Gates is representing a powerful syndicate of northern investors. He has the capital, and he wants to build a massive industrial-scale sawmill. He naturally goes to the nearest established town, which is Hamburg, Arkansas.
Seems logical.
But the local businessmen in Hamburg reject him. They absolutely refuse to sell his syndicate any land. Why? Because they know a massive mill will monopolize the local labor force and inflate wages, threatening their own smaller businesses.
They wanted to protect their turf.
Exactly. So Cap Gates, who is clearly not a man used to being told no, gets furious. He leaves Hamburg, travels 13 miles straight west into a pristine, elevated deer stand in the middle of a virgin forest, and essentially declares, fine, I'm going to build my own town right here.
And that patch of woods became the city of Crosset. Its beginnings were incredibly harsh. In the muddy, freezing winter of 1898, it was known simply as Tent City. The initial laborers lived in brutal conditions under canvas-roofed tents, trying to clear the land.
Sounds miserable.
It was. But under Cap Gates's fierce, unyielding, paternalistic authority, that muddy camp rapidly evolved into one of the most meticulously planned, rigidly controlled company towns in the entire American South. The Crosset Lumber Company didn't just operate the mill, they owned every single residential and commercial structure in the town limits.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's like playing SimCity, but with real people. He acted as a benevolent dictator. He controlled the houses, the hospitals, the Rose Inn, and even the airwaves with that steam whistle.
Oh, the whistles were central to life there. The entire population's daily life was regulated by a ring of 5 massive steam whistles located near the mill's boiler room. These whistles blew at 5:00 a.m., 6:15 a.m., 7 a.m., noon, and evening.
Just dictating every move.
Yep. They didn't just dictate the labor shifts, they signaled when the town's electricity would be turned on and off. The sources note the whistle was so deafeningly loud that it was routinely used to guide lost hunters out of the deep woods miles away.
He managed the psychology of his workforce just as rigidly as the industrial output of his lumber. There's a particularly revealing historical anecdote regarding the founding days of Crosset that highlights this perfectly. Gates recognized a fundamental truth about industrial labor. To maintain a highly disciplined, maximally productive workforce, he had to keep vice-specifically alcohol completely out of his town.
Right, a sober workforce is a productive one.
So he and his foreman orchestrated the construction of the town's first church and schoolhouse at 200 Main Street in a single frenzied night.
Literally overnight.
Wait, hold on. They built a church over a single night. That sounds less like religious piety and more like a mafia move. Why the massive rush?
Because Gates was exploiting a specific state law. Arkansas had a statute that legally prohibited any saloon or tavern from opening and operating within a 3-mile radius of a church.
Well, that's sneaky.
Very. Gates caught wind that an entrepreneur was planning to open a saloon near his camp. By erecting the church overnight, he legally established a 3-mile dry zone before the sun came up. He forced the tavern out of business before it could even pour its first drink, thereby forcibly securing a sober, reliable workforce.
That is a brilliant, ruthless piece of social engineering. He essentially weaponized a church to protect his profit margins. But that relentless drive to engineer, control, and extract didn't stop at the borders of the town or the edge of the forest. The ambition of the 20th century eventually extended to the water itself. Which brings us to the era of modern municipal and navigational engineering. Let's look upstream first, at places like Benton, Arkansas, and the construction of the water purification spillway.
Yeah, the Benton Spillway is a classic example of municipal water engineering. It is a low-head dam designed specifically to impound a portion of the river to ensure that the city's direct intake pumps remain submerged, regardless of natural drought conditions.
Makes sense for the city.
It solves a human problem, yes, but these concrete structures inflict severe ecological fragmentation on the river. More terrifyingly, the fluid dynamics created by a low-head dam are lethal. As the water flows smoothly over the flat crest of the dam, it crashes into the base, creating a perfectly uniform, continuously submerged hydraulic jump, often called a boil.
And why is that boil so dangerous? Like, what happens if you get caught in it?
Well, because it acts as a violent, self-sustaining, recirculating current. It pushes water down along the bottom, back up against the face of the dam, and down again. It is incredibly difficult to escape.
Like a washing machine.
Exactly like a washing machine. This hydraulic trap is capable of capturing floating woody debris, or human paddlers and kayaks, and holding them underwater indefinitely. In swiftwater rescue terminology, low-head dams are grimly referred to as drowning machines.
That is terrifying.
And biologically, it acts as a permanent concrete wall. It completely severs the upstream migration routes of aquatic life, most notably the federally threatened Arkansas fat mucket mussel, which requires specific host fish to carry its larvae upstream. If the fish can't pass the dam, the mussel population is genetically isolated and doomed.
But the Benton Spillway is just a localized roadblock compared to what happened downstream. The ultimate act of engineering, the event that changed the fundamental identity of the entire lower Ouachita saline ecosystem forever, was the completion of the Felsenthal Lock and Dam in 1985. We have to really dig into this because this dam is the ignition switch for the entire ecological mystery we started with.
Right. When the Felsenthal Lock and Dam closed its gates in 1985, it permanently altered the fluvial geomorphology of the basin. In scientific terms, it forcibly shifted the environment from a lotic system, meaning a free-flowing river governed by current, into a lentic system, which is a lake-like, impounded environment.
And they had to figure out how to manage all that water.
Yes, and to manage this massive new body of water, the federal agencies introduced the concept of the dual-phase hydrograph.
Break down that dual-phase hydrograph for us.
Yeah.
How exactly do you manage a river in two phases, and why is this the absolute key to understanding where the fish went?
The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, in cooperation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, manages the water levels based on a strict manual. During the summer and early fall, they hold the water at a normal, stable elevation of approximately 65.0 feet mean sea level.
Okay, so a flat pool.
Right. This creates a permanent 15,000-acre aquatic habitat, effectively a massive sluggish lake. But during the winter and spring wet seasons, the manual dictates a radical shift. They intentionally close the gates and allow the pool elevation to rise by a full 12 feet,
Mhm.
bringing the water level up to 77.0 feet mean sea level.
And when you take a 15,000-acre lake and push the water level up 12 feet, it doesn't just get deeper. The water has nowhere to go but out. It spills violently over the original riverbanks.
Exactly. It pushes water laterally across the floodplain, systematically inundating the surrounding bottomland hardwood forests. By raising the water 12 feet, they expand the aquatic footprint from 15,000 acres to a staggering 36,000 acres.
That is just massive.
It is. This creates what is known as a green tree reservoir, or GTR. The Felsenthal GTR is, in fact, the largest green tree reservoir in the entire world.
It is an almost unimaginable scale of manipulation. We shifted from generations of indigenous peoples and pioneers having to adapt their entire lives to the river's unpredictable natural flood pulse, to humans artificially engineering a massive 36,000-acre flood every single year, like clockwork. And why? Primarily for commercial barge navigation and to attract migratory ducks for recreational waterfowl hunting. It is peak 20th century hubris. We will make the flood happen when we want it to.
It is the ultimate expression of command and control ecology, and this artificial 36,000-acre flood became the primary ecological engine driving the entire Felsenthal Basin. But as we see repeatedly throughout history, when we attempt to rigidly engineer highly complex, dynamic natural systems, there were massive cascading unintended consequences.
Things never go exactly as planned.
Never. The engineers in 1985 believed they had finally mastered the river. But by creating this permanent, chronic, artificial flood, they unwittingly unleashed a slow-motion botanical catastrophe on the exact same majestic forests the lumber barons had prized a century earlier.
Which leads us directly into the fall of the oaks. Now let me play devil's advocate here, or at least act as the proxy for the confused listener. Wait, trees need water to live. We water our plants. Why does giving a forest a giant, reliable, artificial supply of water end up violently killing it?
It really comes down to timing and the physiological limits of the native timber. To understand this botanical collapse, we rely on the 20-year McCoy Oak Mortality Study, which was published in 2010. The problem wasn't just the water itself, it was when the water was present.
The seasonality of it.
Right. Decades of continuous green tree reservoir management subjected these bottomland forests to chronic, prolonged flooding that extended well into the spring and early summer, which is the active growing season. When forest soils are inundated with standing water while the tree is trying to actively grow and metabolize, the root systems experience a condition called anoxia. They are completely and totally deprived of oxygen.
So it's not that the tree's drowning from the top down. It's like forcing someone to hold their breath while running a marathon. Eventually, the system just crashes.
That is a perfect physiological analogy. Deprived of soil oxygen, the tree roots cannot maintain efficient aerobic respiration. But the tree still needs energy to survive, so the root cells are forced to shift to an emergency backup system, anaerobic metabolism.
Which I'm guessing has a downside.
A huge downside. The fatal flaw of anaerobic metabolism is that it produces highly toxic chemical byproducts, specifically ethanol and ethylene gas, which begin to accumulate rapidly in the root tissues. Because the floodwaters don't recede, the roots can't flush the toxins. The trees literally begin to poison themselves from the bottom up.
And the data from the McCoy study isn't just a slight decline, it's a massacre. They documented an annual tree mortality rate of 2.6% across the entire 36,000-acre GTR. And it wasn't just random wook scrub brush dying off. The trees taking the biggest hit were the massive, highly desirable red oaks.
Yes, the study showed that species like the willow oak, the water hickory, and the nuttall oak suffered the greatest losses, with some specific plots experiencing annual mortality rates over 3%. When you compound that over the 2-decade study period, the results are devastating.
It adds up so fast.
Over 60% of the red oaks that were initially cataloged in healthy, vigorous condition degraded to lower vigor classes or died outright. The grand canopy was structurally collapsing. Furthermore, the advanced regeneration of young oak saplings was completely non-existent. An acorn might sprout, but as soon as the seedling leafed out in the spring, the artificial floodwaters would submerge it, drowning the next generation before it could even begin to grow.
Okay, but nature abhors a vacuum. If thousands of massive oak trees are dying and the canopy is suddenly opening up, blasting sunlight down onto the swamp floor, something's going to take advantage of that. What replaces the mighty oak?
As the less flood-tolerant oak canopy died away, The native climax trees simply could not regenerate in the toxic anaerobic soils. Instead, the newly opened ecological niches were rapidly overrun by early successional hyperflood-tolerant shrubs.
Like weeds, basically.
Essentially, yes. The botanical surveys documented a massive explosive proliferation of two specific plants, buttonbush and buckbrush.
Let's dig into the biology of that. Why does a scrubby little buttonbush plant survive and thrive in this toxic, anoxic, ethanol-poisoned root soup when a 100-year-old oak tree suffocates and dies?
It's a matter of highly specialized physiological resilience. Experimental botanical studies demonstrated that when you subject competing native species, like swamp tupelo, to prolonged deep flooding, their photosynthetic capacity plummets and their total biomass drops significantly. They shut down.
They just give up.
But the buttonbush has an almost miraculous cellular recovery capability. Even after being completely submerged and subjected to the same anoxia, the buttonbush physiology rebounds incredibly rapidly once the water stabilizes. Its metabolic pathways are adapted to process or tolerate the anaerobic byproducts, allowing it to easily outcompete the dying native oaks and aggressively colonize every single expanding canopy gap.
So the landscape undergoes this massive, unstoppable botanical shift. And what does that actually mean for the animals living there? Because the loss of red oaks isn't just a cosmetic issue, it's the loss of hard-massed acorns. Acorns are the caloric base for the entire terrestrial food web. They feed the deer, the wild turkeys, the migrating mallards, and even the fish that wait under the branches. But the buttonbush isn't entirely bad, right? It provides something else.
Right. In the realm of ecology, species are rarely inherently good or bad. They simply alter the flow of energy. For the aquatic fishery, this massive shift fundamentally changed the spatial dynamics of survival. The buttonbush doesn't provide acorns, but what it does provide is dense, incredibly complex, woody physical structure.
Like an underwater jungle.
Exactly. That underwater thicket provides the optimal predator-sheltered nursery habitat for the newly hatched fry of largemouth bass, crappie, and various sunfish species. It acts as a massive fortified incubator for juvenile fish.
But for the humans trying to navigate it, I want the listener to really picture this transformation. Imagine what was once a majestic, open canopy oak forest. During a spring flood, you could easily glide a small aluminum boat right between the massive, widely spaced tree trunks. It was open and navigable.
A beautiful place to be.
Right. But over 20 years, that open forest died, collapsed, and was replaced by a dense, thorny, interwoven, entirely impenetrable 36,000-acre swamp. You literally cannot physically force a boat through a mature buttonbush thicket.
Exactly. The unintended consequence of the engineered flood was that it effectively manufactured massive, unfishable refugia. It created a fortress where fish populations can easily retreat, successfully spawn, and thrive, completely protected from any kind of human fishing pressure.
And while the shoreline and the flooding forests were transforming into this impenetrable woody fortress, an equally dramatic and chaotic biological invasion was taking place beneath the surface of the main water itself. And this right here is where we finally get into the infamous golden era of Felsenthal fishing.
Yes, the period spanning the late 1990s through the early 2000s. During this time frame, the permanent 15,000-acre summer pool experienced a catastrophic, rapid-onset invasion of aquatic macrophytes. We're primarily talking about the aggressive, non-native plant hydrilla growing alongside native species like coontail and fanwort.
It just exploded.
The growth was explosive. By midsummer, dense, continuous, floating mats of submerged aquatic vegetation choked up to 75% of the total water surface. That equates to roughly 12,000 acres of impenetrable weed mats floating on the reservoir.
Now, this hydrilla invasion created a massive ecological paradox.
Yeah.
On one hand, from a water quality perspective, it was an absolute nightmare. The biological mechanics of 12,000 acres of weeds are terrifying. During the day, they photosynthesize, but at night, the respiration and eventual decay of all that plant mass consumes vast amounts of dissolved oxygen.
It suffocates the water.
Yeah, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service reports from that era documented severe localized hypoxia, which is a critical depletion of oxygen in the water column. This hypoxia directly resulted in massive fish die-offs, particularly in the hot, stagnant months of September and October. The water was literally suffocating the life inside it. But on the other hand, if you talk to the anglers who were there, they talk about the late 90s like it was a mythological fishing paradise. Why? How can a suffocating lake provide the best fishing of their lives?
To understand the illusion of the golden era, you have to analyze how that massive volume of vegetation manipulated the spatial distribution of the adult sport fish. The 12,000 acres of dense weed mats physically restricted the amount of navigable open water.
There's nowhere else for them to go.
Exactly. It completely filled the shallow flats and the mid-depth zones. This structural change forced the adult largemouth bass and crappie out of their normal dispersed patterns. It concentrated them heavily onto the steep, deep-water outer edges of the weed mats and forced them into the narrow remaining navigable boat lanes.
I want to give the listener an analogy here. Imagine you are at a massive party in a sprawling multi-room mansion. Everyone is spread out, mingling in different rooms. But suddenly, the walls of the rooms start physically moving inward, slowly forcing every single guest out of the rooms and packing them tightly into the main central hallway. That moving wall is the hydrilla.
I love that visual.
It's really easy to find your friends, or in this case, the fish, when they're shoved shoulder to shoulder in the hallway. The anglers experience artificially inflated, unbelievably high catch rates, not because there were magically more fish, but because the fish were literally cornered on the weed lines. They were like fish in a barrel.
That is precisely what happened. Agency assessment reports from that specific time period explicitly stated that the waters were absolutely teeming with bass and bluegill. The biological problem wasn't a lack of fish. The human problem was that boaters physically couldn't navigate their vessels through the choking vegetation to reach other areas.
It was impassable.
Recognizing that the severe hypoxia and the navigational blockages were entirely unsustainable for the ecosystem, the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service realized they had to intervene. Pumping chemical herbicides into 12,000 acres of a flowing river system was logistically impossible and environmentally reckless. So they turned to a biological control agent.
Enter the grass carp. In 2006, the agencies made the call to introduce triploid grass carp into the reservoir. Now, triploid means they were genetically altered to be sterile, so they couldn't reproduce and overpopulate. But they didn't just dump a truckload of carp into the river and cross their fingers. They needed data. They actually surgically implanted radio transmitters into 48 adult carp to see exactly how these biological lawnmowers would behave in the system.
The resulting telemetry study was fascinating and provided crucial management data. The tracking proved that the grass carp did exactly what they were supposed to do. They stayed within the reservoir pool, establishing a massive average home range of 576 hectares per fish.
Just patrolling the waters.
They actively patrolled and aggressively consumed the heavily vegetated margins. Over the next few years, their relentless feeding successfully eradicated the hydrilla canopy.
And here is where the public perception violently disconnects from the biological reality. Think back to our mansion party analogy. The grass carp essentially knocked down the walls. Once the hydrilla was eaten, the walls of the hallway disappeared. The bass and crappie no longer had those highly defined, concentrated weed edges holding them in place. So what did the fish do?
They spread out.
They behaved exactly like wild animals should. They dispersed evenly across the entire 15,000-acre open reservoir, and when the winter floods hit, they retreated deep into that newly formed, impenetrable buttonbush green tree reservoir we just talked about.
Which leads directly to the massive angler backlash. Because the sport fish were no longer artificially concentrated in a few accessible boat lanes, the catch rates for the average angler plummeted drastically.
They couldn't find them anymore.
Anglers standing at the local boat ramp screamed that the fish population had crashed, pointing fingers and blaming everything from the management agency's incompetence to the water level fluctuations.
But the party isn't over. The guests just spread out. The walls of the mansion got knocked down, and everyone scattered into a 36,000-acre overgrown backyard. The electrofishing data collected by the biologists proved that the biological biomass was still highly robust. The fish didn't die. They just achieved perfect concealment in the buttonbush.
This does, however, raise an incredibly important scientific and philosophical question. If the fish dispersed evenly into the deep channels and hid inside the impenetrable buttonbush thickets, how do scientists actually know they're still there? How do you accurately measure a massive aquatic population that you can no longer easily see and that anglers can no longer easily catch?
And it turns out the answer to that question is that for decades, we were looking for them the absolute wrong way. Which brings us to the inherent biases of our scientific sampling technology and the recent uncovering of the hidden biomass.
When we talk about how fisheries are formally sampled by biologists, we must acknowledge a fundamental truth of field science. Every single tool ever invented has an inherent mechanical bias.
You only catch what your net allows.
Precisely. If a biologist sets a gill net across a channel, they will effectively catch the large, free-swimming pelagic fish. but the mesh size ensures they completely miss the small, vital forage fish that slip right through. If they drag a fine mesh seine net across a shallow sandbar, they will catch every minnow and darter, but they completely fail to sample the massive predators hiding in the deep, fast-flowing channels.
And for decades, the absolute gold standard for agencies like the Game and Fish Commission has been boat-mounted electrofishing. But there is a massive hidden flaw in how that technology interacts with deep water. Standard high-frequency electrofishing, which typically operates between 60 to 120 hertz, is fantastic for shocking and stunning bass and sunfish in the shallow, near-shore environments.
It works great in the shallows.
But the physics of electricity and water are limiting. The electrical field completely attenuates, meaning it weakens, spreads out, and loses its effective voltage gradient in water deeper than 3 meters.
Which means that for decades, standard electrofishing surveys were practically blind. They were completely missing the deep channel benthic species, the massive catfish, the heavy buffalo, the ancient gar holding tight to the bottom of the deep scour holes. These apex fish were practically invisible to the primary assessment tool used by the state.
The X-ray machine couldn't penetrate the deep mud.
Exactly. But in 2022, a breakthrough study by researchers Martin and Thompson completely changed our understanding of the lower Ouachita and Saline biomass. They didn't use new nets, they changed the physics of the tool, they utilized low-frequency electrofishing.
They dropped the electrical frequency way down to 15 hertz, utilizing a highly specific 10% duty cycle. Now, what does that specific electrical wavelength actually do to a monster fish resting at the bottom of a 20-foot deep scour hole?
It relies on hacking the fish's neurology through a process called galvanotaxis. Standard high-frequency shocks, the 16 to 120 hertz range, cause immediate tetany. Tetany is complete muscle paralysis.
They just lock up.
Right. If you paralyze a 50-pound catfish resting at the bottom of a 20-foot hole, its muscles lock up, it loses buoyancy, and it just sinks deeper into the mud. You never see it surface. But a 15 hertz pulse delivered at a 10% duty cycle does not cause paralysis. Instead, it induces galvanotaxis.
What does that mean for the fish?
The specific low-frequency electrical pulse bypasses the fish's voluntary motor control and forces its nervous system to compulsively fire. It forces the fish to actively swim upward along the electrical voltage gradient, directly out of the deep scour holes and toward the boat's anode at the surface, all without ever paralyzing them.
It essentially acts as an electrical hypnotist, commanding these massive predators to swim up to the surface and present themselves. And the results of that 2022 study were just mind-blowing. When they switched to the low-frequency setting, they saw a staggering 28% higher catch rate for quality-sized flathead catfish. We're talking fish over 510 millimeters in length.
The low-frequency data definitively proved that the apex predator biomass hiding in those deep channels was exponentially higher and far healthier than decades of historical surveys had indicated. The fish were there the entire time. They were simply evading detection because we were using the wrong physical principles to search for them.
Which is wild to think about.
And we are seeing similar, shocking revelations regarding the apex predator of the entire system, utilizing acoustic telemetry tracking of the alligator gar.
Right, the alligator gar. A literal dinosaur of a fish. Telemetry tracking involves surgically placing acoustic pingers in the fish and listening to where they go. The data show that these massive prehistoric gar are actively utilizing the deep Atlantic pool and the turbulent dam tailwaters as ambush points. But the crazy part is their behavior. The telemetry revealed they remain completely, absolutely stationary for up to 28% of the entire year.
Just waiting.
So we literally thought the river was empty of these monster catfish and gar simply because our electrical equipment was accidentally stunning them at the bottom of the river where we couldn't see them, or because the gar were just sitting perfectly still in the dark.
That is exactly what the data implies. Our understanding was severely artificially limited by our methods.
It's like using a metal detector to look for diamonds. You sweep the beach for days, the machine never beeps once, and you write a formal scientific paper concluding that the beach is totally devoid of treasure. But the treasure is there. You're just using a machine designed to detect iron to look for a carbon diamond. You're using the wrong frequency to measure reality. It makes you wonder, how much of our understanding of the natural world is entirely an illusion created by the limits of the tools we invented to measure it?
It is a profound philosophical realization for any scientist. And to really appreciate the hidden diversity that these new tools and perspectives are finally revealing, let's walk the listener through a virtual transect of this entire system.
Let's do it.
If you start way up in the free-flowing Saline River, the Lotic environment, the substrate is composed of clean, shifting gravel and sandbars. This specific microhabitat supports highly sensitive, highly specialized species. You find the stargazing darter, a designated species of greatest conservation need, which possesses specialized upward-looking eyes and feeds exclusively on tiny snails scoured from fast-moving gravel riffles.
Very specialized.
You have the scaly sand darter, an incredible fish that literally buries its entire body in the clean sand, leaving only its eyes exposed to ambush passing prey. And you find the rare, state-endemic peppered shiner hiding in the emergent beds of water willow.
But then, as you take your boat downstream, the river changes. The turbulent current slows down, the water deepens, and you hit the stagnant lentic pool of the Felsenthal Reservoir. The clean, shifting gravel disappears, completely replaced by decades of soft, accumulated organic mud. The sensitive darters vanish. In their place, the biomass shifts entirely.
It becomes a different world.
The system becomes dominated by massive smallmouth buffalo, filtering the organic detritus from the mud, vast pelagic schools of paddlefish swimming with their mouths open, and those massive, deep, scour-hole flathead catfish we just talked about. It is an incredibly rich, stratified, and highly adapted biological system.
It truly is. But while we finally have the scientific technology to see and appreciate the true, robust health of this native fish biomass, we cannot ignore the future. A genuine, almost invisible threat is currently swimming up the Mississippi Basin, poised to dismantle this entire complex food web from the bottom up.
And that brings us to the modern threat, the Asian carp invasion.
Specifically, we are tracking the infiltration of the silver carp and the bighead carp. The historical irony here is tragic. They were originally intentionally imported to the United States in the 1960s and 70s by agricultural researchers.
With good intentions, supposedly.
They were brought in for aquaculture, specifically to act as biological cleaners to consume excess algae out of commercial wastewater treatment ponds. But predictably, during severe regional floods, the ponds overflowed, and these highly adaptable carp escaped into the massive, interconnected Mississippi River basin. They have been relentlessly, steadily marching upstream ever since, officially arriving and establishing breeding populations within the Felsenthal boundaries about 2015.
And they are an absolute ecological nightmare, not because of teeth or aggression, but because of their specific mechanism of feeding. They don't eat bass, they don't eat crappie, they don't actively hunt other fish at all. They are obligate filter feeders. They swim endlessly through the water column with their massive mouths wide open, straining and consuming unimaginable, massive quantities of microscopic phytoplankton and zooplankton.
And if we connect this single biological trait to the bigger picture of the Ouachita saline food web, we can clearly model a devastating trophic cascade. The problem is that Asian carp eat the exact same microscopic plankton that native forage fish, specifically the gizzard shad and the threadfin shad, rely on for survival.
And the shad are critical.
They are, because those immense pelagic schools of silvery shad are the foundational caloric forage base. They are the primary engine that drives the growth and survival of every apex predator in the open reservoir.
Right. So let's trace the domino effect. By vacuuming millions of gallons of water and stripping it of plankton, the Asian carp are effectively starving the shad. And by starving the shad, they are indirectly starving the apex visual predators, the largemouth bass and the crappie. The base suddenly have to swim further, hunt longer, and expend drastically more physical energy just to find a single meal.
It just wrecks their energy budget.
This caloric deficit stunts their growth rates and severely ruins the strength of the entire year class. And the devastation isn't just limited to the adults. We have to look at the nursery. Every single sport fish, whether it's a bass or a sunfish, starts its life as a tiny, vulnerable fry. And what does a half-inch fry eat? It has to eat zooplankton in its first few critical weeks of life. If the Asian carp have already vacuumed up all the zooplankton, entire generations of native game fish will literally starve to death before they grow an inch long.
It places severe, compounding bioenergetic stress on the native predators. There is a fascinating study by Eggleton et al. That specifically examined largemouth bass populations within the Felsenthal system. The genetic analysis showed that the bass there possessed the genetic potential for very fast growth, but the physical reality of the environment is working against them.
The currents are too strong.
The study demonstrated that the high seasonal flood pulses, the turbulent artificial currents generated by the managed dual-phase hydrograph, already forced the base to expend excessive caloric energy just fighting the flow to hold their position.
It's like forcing an athlete to run on a treadmill set at maximum speed, but simultaneously taking away their protein shakes and only feeding them celery. They have the supreme genetics to be a bodybuilder, but they are burning drastically more calories than they can possibly consume from their environment. And when you add a horde of plankton-stealing Asian carp to an environment where the base are already exhausted from fighting the current, the base faces a severe, insurmountable bioenergetic crisis.
Beyond the invisible biological collapse, there is also the highly visible physical danger to the human beings utilizing the river. Silver carp are uniquely biologically sensitive to the specific acoustic frequencies generated by outboard boat motors.
The jumping hazard.
Yes, when a motorized boat drives through a school, the acoustic vibration triggers a panning response, causing the carp to leap violently up to 10 feet out of the water in massive numbers. Imagine driving a boat at 30 miles an hour and suddenly a dense barrage of 30 or 40-pound rock-solid fish begins flying through the air directly at your head.
It sounds like a horror movie.
It is incredibly dangerous. The situation became so critical that the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission implemented a direct commercial harvest subsidy. They are currently offering 18 cents per pound out of their own budget, simply to incentivize commercial fishermen to pull as much of this invasive biomass out of the river as possible.
Which naturally brings us right back to the limits of our engineering hubris. I know what the listener is thinking, because it's what I thought. If we know exactly where they are, and we have the low-frequency electrofishing technology to pull massive fish to the surface, and we are literally paying bounties to people to catch them, why can't we just engineer a solution? Why not send a fleet of shock boats out and fish them all out until they are eradicated?
Because it is a sheer biological impossibility in an open, massive, flood-pulsed river system. The scale is the enemy of eradication. The river is simply too massive, the seasonal floodplain is too expansive and inaccessible, and the reproductive rate of the Asian carp is mathematically overwhelming.
They just breed too fast.
A single female can lay hundreds of thousands of eggs. We can attempt to manage their aggregate numbers through commercial subsidies, but total, permanent eradication is functionally impossible without deploying chemical or biological weapons that would completely destroy the native ecosystem alongside them.
So the main channel of the river is effectively under permanent siege. But this basin isn't just one single wide river. It's fed by an intricate, sprawling network of tributaries. And when you look closely at these tributary creeks, you see the extreme dichotomy of this entire watershed laid bare.
Yes, the concept of the tributary sanctuaries. If you analyze a waterway like Morrow Creek, it represents a nearly pristine biological refugium. Modern academic assessments have confirmed that Morrow Creek supports a staggering 63 distinct fish species, including an incredibly sensitive population of 17 distinct species of freshwater mussels.
Wow, an untouched Eden.
It really stands as an untouched Eden of biodiversity. Because it is somewhat isolated from the massive navigational manipulations, it acts as a critical, stable spawning ground and a thermal refuge for species escaping the altered conditions of the Ouachita main channel.
But then, just a few miles away in the very same basin, you have Coffee Creek. And Coffee Creek represents the absolute darkest side of our industrial history. Historically, Coffee Creek was utilized as an open sewer. It received an average of 45 million gallons of inadequately treated, highly toxic paper mill effluent every single day from the Georgia Pacific plant located up in Crosset.
The pollution was staggering.
The state regulatory bodies actually threw their hands up and gave Coffee Creek a formal no aquatic life designated use exemption. The water was fundamentally incompatible with life. It was so polluted with massive biochemical oxygen demand, meaning the chemicals stripped all the oxygen from the water, along with extreme levels of chlorides, sulfates, and trace heavy metals, that standard electrofishing surveys were literally physically impossible. The electrical conductivity of the toxic water was so extreme it shorted out the equipment.
It was for decades a federally exempted, legally sanctioned industrial dumping ground. Now, it's important to note that recent scientific reassessments have modeled that if the effluent is finally managed and diverted, the creek actually possesses the baseline geomorphological potential to recover a robust aquatic community.
So there is hope.
But the juxtaposition of Morrow Creek and Coffee Creek highlights the extreme, almost absurd patchwork of humanity's best and worst environmental impulses, existing side by side within the exact same river basin.
So after exploring all of this, what does this all mean for the future of the Ouachita? pulling all these wildly diverse threads together, from the indigenous astronomers aligning their dead with the Milky Way to the pioneer women mastering thermodynamics to make lye soap. From Cap Gates weaponizing a church to build his timber empire, to the massive 36,000-acre engineered floods that suffocated the oaks, the hydrilla boom, the grass carp telemetry, the low-frequency electrofishing pulling monsters from the deep, and now the relentless march of the Asian carp. After all of that, what is the core defining takeaway for you, the listener?
If we attempt to summarize this exhaustive 40-year scientific and historical journey, the ultimate empirical truth is this. The fish didn't disappear. The biological biomass of the river is remarkably robust and highly adapted.
Still there.
But the ecosystem was fundamentally structurally re-engineered by human hands. We changed the depth, we changed the flow, we changed the canopy, and we introduced new species. In doing so, we unwittingly shifted the physical and biological advantage completely away from the human angler and directly over to the fish.
It proves that nature is incredibly, stubbornly elastic and resilient. When human beings push a complex system to its absolute limits, whether we do it with concrete dams, massive clear-cutting of virgin timber, or the careless introduction of invasive filter feeders, the system doesn't necessarily just collapse and die. It absorbs the blow. It adapts. It completely redistributes its biomass, and it finds a brand new, highly complex equilibrium. The lower Ouachita Saline River isn't dying. It is just forever changed.
It survives, absolutely, but it survives entirely on its own terms, often retreating into deep, dark, impenetrable places where our boats and our traditional tools cannot easily follow.
And as promised at the beginning of our journey, we want to leave you with one final, incredibly provocative thought, built entirely on the historical and geographical sources we've explored today. Throughout this deep dive, we have talked extensively about the concept of concealment, how the dense, flooded buttonbush thickets hide the dispersed base, and how the deep, murky scour holes hide the massive flathead catfish from the electrofishing boats.
Right. The natural geomorphology of the river actively acts as a mechanism of supreme biological protection.
But that exact same geomorphology, the deep, swirling scour holes, the impenetrable, murky depths of the Blentic Pool, the constantly shifting alluvial sands that erase tracks overnight, also acts as what we could accurately call forensic concealment infrastructure.
It hides more than just fish.
The river doesn't just provide a perfect hiding place for fish. Historically, its untamable opacity has made it a highly active hotspot for hiding human crimes.
The profound opacity of the water, combined with the powerful, unpredictable currents and deep mud, makes the river an active, highly efficient agent in degrading and swallowing physical evidence. The historical records of Ashley County reflect this dark utility. You can trace this back to the 1898 execution of Charles Clyburn, a grim event that followed a brutal murder deep within the Ouachita Basin.
And it didn't stop in 1898.
No. And this utility of concealment continues into the modern era. The sources document numerous homicides throughout the late 1990s and 2000s where victims' bodies, firearms, and critical physical evidence were deliberately dumped into the deep currents of the Saline and Ouachita rivers. Violent, sudden altercations at remote, isolated boat ramps frequently ended with the evidence being rapidly swallowed by the swift, muddy water, never to be seen again.
The river isn't just a backdrop. It actively acts as an accomplice. It keeps its secrets with absolute perfection. Whether that secret is a 50-pound flathead catfish effortlessly evading a state biologist's standard electrofishing boat, or the darkest, most violent elements of human history, resting silently deep within the anaerobic silt. It brings us right back to where we started our conversation today. You simply cannot just take a clean X-ray of a river. You are looking into the profound, untamable opacity of the water. It is a massive, ancient system that absorbs absolutely every single thing we throw at it. Our dams, our chemicals, our invasive species, and our violence, and it simply flows on.
It remains a diagnostic landscape of deep, muddy waters, forever hiding both the incredible beauty of biological resilience and the darkest shadows of our own human history.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning what lies beneath the surface.